Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive.
Wait.
You know how much we love getting into those really thorny philosophical issues, right? And so today we're diving into a topic that's like right at the heart of how we think about right and wrong,
Mhm.
good and bad, moral particularism versus moral generalism.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a mouthful, but it boils down to this really basic question. Are there like these universal moral principles that apply in every situation? Or does morality depend more on the specifics of each case? And what's so interesting about this is that it goes beyond just abstract philosophy.
Yeah.
It really gets to the core of how we make decisions in our daily lives. Should we always tell the truth no matter what? Or are there times when a little white lie might actually be the better choice?
I think this is one of those debates that it's not just theoretical. It can get kind of personal, right? Because we all have these moments where we're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. And sometimes we think back to rules or principles that we've learned. And sometimes it feels like those don't really fit the situation.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think for anyone who's ever felt that kind of tension between the rule and the specifics of what's happening, this is going to be a really thought-provoking dive.
I totally agree. So let's start off by just getting clear on what we mean by these terms, moral particularism and moral generalism.
Okay, so let's begin with moral generalism. This is the view that we can understand morality best through general principles or rules. These principles, they try to capture what's morally right and wrong in a way that applies across different situations. So, for example, a generalist might say that lying is always wrong, or we should always help those in need. The idea here is that these principles provide a kind of framework for making moral judgments.
Yeah, it's not just about coming up with random rules, right?
Yeah.
Generalists usually try to find principles that are grounded in some deeper reason or justification.
Mhm.
Like, they might argue that these principles lead to the best outcomes overall, or that they're based on some fundamental aspect of human nature or rationality.
Absolutely. In fact, a lot of ethical theories that we're familiar with fall under the generalist umbrella. Think about utilitarianism, for example. It advocates for maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, right? And that becomes the overarching principle for determining right and wrong. Or deontology, which emphasizes duties and rights. You could formulate principles like always keep your promises or never treat a person merely as a means to an end. So you can see how influential this generalist thinking has been in shaping moral philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of intuitive in a way, right? We want some guidelines to help us make sense of a complex world.
Yeah.
So where does moral particularism fit into all of this?
Well, as you might expect, moral particularism offers a contrasting perspective. Particularists are skeptical of these grand universal moral principles. They argue that morality is much more messy and context-dependent than generalists make it seem.
Yeah, so it's not that they're against all principles or rules, right? It's more that they think those rules have limitations and might not always be the best guide for action.
Exactly. Particularists emphasize the importance of paying attention to the details of each situation, the unique context in which a moral problem arises. They might say that a feature that's morally relevant in one case might be totally irrelevant in another, or that the same action could be right in one context and wrong in another. It all depends on the specifics.
Okay, I'm starting to get the difference here. So for generalists, it's about finding those consistent principles that hold true across the board. And for particularists, it's about being sensitive to the nuances of each individual situation.
Precisely. And this difference in emphasis leads to some really interesting and sometimes quite heated debates in various areas of philosophy. We're talking metaphysics, epistemology, normative theory, even the philosophy of language. The scope of this disagreement is pretty huge.
Yeah, I can imagine. So let's get into the specifics of these arguments. Where should we start?
Well, it's helpful to understand a little bit of the history behind these ideas. Where did they come from? Who are some of the key figures? So for particularism, we can trace some of its roots back to Aristotle. Now, he didn't explicitly use the term particularism, but his emphasis on practical wisdom, on the importance of judgment and perception in ethics, really resonates with the particularist perspective. He famously said that the discernment rests with perception, suggesting that you can't just apply rules blindly, you need to be attuned to the specifics of the situation.
Yeah, that rings true, doesn't it? I mean, we've all been in situations where just following the rules felt wrong somehow because something about the context made it different.
Exactly. Now, for generalism, it's a bit trickier to pinpoint a single founding father. The rise of generalism is often tied to the development of major ethical theories that center on universal principles, like utilitarianism and Kantian deontology, which we touched on earlier. These theories sought to provide systematic and principle-based accounts of morality. So, while there's no one figure like Aristotle for particularism, the influence of generalism is deeply ingrained in the history of moral philosophy.
Okay, so we have a bit of historical context. Now let's dive into the actual arguments. Where do we see the biggest clashes between particularism and generalism?
Well, a good place to start is with the metaphysical arguments. These get to the very core of what morality is and whether moral principles, as generalists understand them, actually exist.
Okay, so metaphysics, the big questions about the nature of reality, how does that apply to this debate about moral principles?
Right. So when generalists talk about moral principles, they often see them as something like laws of nature, but for morality. They think these principles capture objective truths about what's right and wrong, and that they hold true universally, regardless of the specific context. So, like the law of gravity applies everywhere. A moral principle like stealing is wrong would apply in every situation for a generalist.
But particularists push back on this idea, right? They don't think morality works like a set of unchanging laws.
Exactly. They argue that the moral relevance of a feature can change from one situation to the next. What's a reason to do something in one case might be a reason not to do it in another, or it might be totally irrelevant. Particularists emphasize this idea of holism, where the moral significance of something depends on its relations to everything else in that specific context.
So it's all about how things fit together in a particular situation, not just about applying a rule blindly.
Right. So imagine you're thinking about whether to tell a white lie to protect someone's feelings. A generalist might say, lying is always wrong, end of story. But a particularist might say, well, it depends. Is this a situation where honesty is paramount, or is it more important to prevent harm? They would want to consider all the details, like the relationship involved, the potential consequences of telling the truth, and the person's reasons for wanting to lie in the first place. So you see how the same feature, in this case honesty or dishonesty, can have a different moral weight depending on the context.
That makes sense. It's like the particularist is looking at the whole picture, not just isolating one feature and applying a rule.
Precisely. And this difference in perspective has big implications for how we think about moral knowledge. How do we come to know what's right and wrong if there aren't these fixed moral principles?
Yeah, that's a big question. If morality isn't about learning and applying rules, then how do we develop moral understanding?
Well, particularists often draw an analogy to skills or expertise. Think about a master chess player or a skilled chef. They don't necessarily follow a set of explicit rules every time they make a move or cook a dish, right? They've developed a kind of intuitive sense of what works in different situations based on their experience and understanding of the nuances of their craft. So in the same way, particularists argue that moral understanding comes from developing a kind of moral perception, an ability to discern what's relevant and important in different moral contexts.
So it's more like developing a good judgment rather than memorizing a rule book.
Yeah, exactly. And they point out that even when we do use rules or principles, we still need judgment to apply them well. No rule can anticipate every possible situation. So even generalists rely on some degree of particularist thinking when it comes to putting those principles into practice.
Okay, that's interesting. It sounds like there's some overlap between these two perspectives when it comes to the actual process of making moral decisions.
There is, and that's where things get really interesting, because even if generalists concede that some judgment is needed, they still maintain that principles play an essential role in guiding that judgment. They might say that principles provide a framework, a starting point for moral deliberation, even if we need to adjust them in light of specific circumstances.
So kind of like a default setting that we can override if needed.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But particularists worry that even having these default principles can lead to a kind of moral blindness, where we're so focused on applying the rule that we miss important features of the situation. They argue that it's better to approach each case with an open mind, to really see what's at stake, rather than trying to fit it into a predetermined category.
I think it's a really tough balancing act, right? On the one hand, you want some guidance, some structure to help you navigate moral dilemmas. But on the other hand, you don't want to become so rigid that you lose sight of the nuances of each situation.
Absolutely. And this tension is at the heart of the debate. There's also the question of how we justify our moral beliefs. Generalists often appeal to principles as a way to provide reasons for our actions. If I say stealing is wrong, I can then point to a principle like Respecting property rights is essential for a just society as a justification.
But particularists would say that the justification needs to be grounded in the specifics of the case.
Right. Right. They argue that the real moral work lies in explaining why a particular action is right or wrong in this specific instance, taking into account all the relevant details. They might say that appealing to a general principle is often too simplistic and doesn't do justice to the complexity of moral decision-making.
Okay, so it's not just about what we should do, but also about how we explain and justify our actions to ourselves and others.
Precisely. And this brings us to another area of disagreement: the practical implications of each view. Do generalists and particularists actually make different moral decisions? And are there certain moral goods that one view is better at achieving than the other?
Yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? Does this theoretical debate actually make a difference in how we live our lives?
Well, that's where things get a bit tricky because it's hard to isolate the influence of a particular moral framework on someone's actions. But generalists do argue that having principles can help us to be more consistent in our moral decision-making, to avoid making exceptions for ourselves or those we favor. And principles can also provide a basis for holding people accountable for their actions. If we agree on certain moral standards, we can then judge whether someone's behavior meets those standards.
But particularists might say that accountability doesn't require principles, right? You can still judge someone's actions based on the specific circumstances and whether they acted reasonably given those circumstances.
That's right. They might also worry that a focus on principles can actually hinder moral progress. If we're too attached to certain rules, we might be resistant to recognizing new moral insights or changing our views in light of new information.
Yeah, I can see how a rigid adherence to principles could make it harder to adapt to new situations or challenges.
Exactly. And this gets to another point that particularists make. They emphasize the role of moral imagination in navigating complex moral dilemmas. They argue that we need to be able to see things from different perspectives, to envision alternative possibilities, and to be sensitive to the emotional and relational aspects of moral situations, which might not always be captured by abstract principles.
So it's not just about reasoning, it's also about empathy and understanding.
Precisely. Now, none of this is to say that generalists don't value empathy or understanding, but they might argue that principles can actually help us to be more empathetic by providing a framework for considering the interests of others. For example, a principle like treat others as you would want to be treated can encourage us to put ourselves in another person's shoes and to think about how our actions might affect them.
Okay, so there's a possibility for some common ground here, even though the emphasis is different.
There is. And I think one of the valuable takeaways from this debate is that it forces us to reflect on our own moral reasoning. Do we tend to rely more on principles or on the specifics of each case? And are there times when one approach seems more appropriate than the other? It's not about choosing one side and sticking with it dogmatically, but rather about being aware of the strengths and weaknesses of both perspectives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering if there's a final thought-provoking question we can leave our listeners with, something that gets to the heart of this debate and maybe even challenges their own assumptions about morality.
How about this? Think about a situation where someone did something that you considered morally wrong. Now, try to explain why it was wrong. Did you appeal to a general principle or rule? Or did you focus more on the specific details of the situation? And what would happen if you tried to explain it from the opposite perspective? Could you make a convincing case using the approach you didn't initially choose? This kind of exercise can help us to see the complexities of moral reasoning and to appreciate the insights that both particularism and generalism have to offer.
That's a great challenge. And I think it highlights the fact that this debate isn't just an academic exercise. It has real implications for how we understand ourselves and how we interact with the world around us.
Absolutely.
So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and see where your own moral compass leads you. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.